U.S. pastor kidnapped in South Africa. During church service, a growing security crisis with global implications, a shocking abduction in the house of God. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. The sanctuary was meant to be safe, but evil walked through its doors. An American pastor kidnapped in the middle of a church service in South Africa. The sacred violated. The nation shaken. What does this say about the state of security in Africa today? This is not just one man's story, it's a call to action for an entire continent. In a disturbing incident that has sent shockwaves across South Africa and drawn attention from international authorities, a 45-year-old American pastor, Josh Sullivan, was abducted during a live church service at Fellowship Baptist Church in Motherwell, a township in Gqeberha, formerly Port Elizabeth, Eastern Cape. The incident occurred on the evening of Thursday, April 10, 2025, as Sullivan led worship alongside his wife and children. According to South African Police Service, SAP's spokesperson Captain Andre Bage, 4 armed and masked male suspects stormed the church, stole mobile phones, and fled with Sullivan in his silver Toyota Fortuner. Although the vehicle was later recovered, the pastor remains missing. The U.S. State Department has confirmed awareness of the kidnapping, stating that there is no greater priority than the safety and security of U.S. citizens abroad. BBC News, 2025. The rise of kidnappings in South Africa. A national emergency. South Africa is no stranger to violence, but the latest incident highlights a troubling upward trajectory in organized kidnappings, particularly for ransom, political intimidation, and transnational crime. According to SAP's crime statistics released in 2024, kidnappings have increased by 264% over the past decade, with hotspots including urban areas in Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Eastern Cape. The case of Pastor Sullivan has now been handed over to the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, commonly known as the Hawks, which handles organized crime, commercial crime, and corruption. Just days before Sullivan's abduction, another Chinese national was kidnapped in Gqeberha, underscoring the growing risk faced by foreign nationals and investors in South Africa, News 24, 2025. The proliferation of armed gangs, lack of police capacity, and sophisticated criminal networks have made kidnapping an increasingly common and lucrative crime. Critical analysis. What this means for South Africa's security image. The kidnapping of a foreign missionary inside a place of worship touches on multiple fault lines in South Africa's governance and law enforcement structures. First, it raises urgent concerns about police visibility and response in underserved townships like Motherwell. Second, it undermines the image of South Africa as a safe destination for foreign nationals, whether missionaries, tourists, or investors. This incident will likely weigh heavily on South Africa's diplomatic relations, particularly with the United States, a key trade and aid partner. Washington's increasing concern about the safety of its citizens abroad could impact the U.S.-South Africa bilateral relationship, including travel advisories and consular operations. South Africa's 2024 National Development Plan, NDP, had prioritized public safety and targeted a reduction in violent crimes by 50% by 2030. However, with cases like Sullivan's dominating global headlines, these goals appear more aspirational than attainable unless drastic policy interventions are implemented. Africa-wide comparison. Is South Africa an outlier or a symptom of a larger trend? While South Africa's kidnapping rate is alarmingly high, it is not the only African nation grappling with abductions. In Nigeria, kidnappings for ransom have become so normalized that schoolchildren, clerics, and even government officials are frequent targets. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, reported over 2,600 kidnapping incidents across Nigeria in 2023 alone. In contrast, Ghana and Rwanda report significantly fewer kidnappings, largely due to community policing efforts, advanced surveillance infrastructure, and swift judicial processes. The contrast reveals the importance of state capacity and institutional strength in curbing such crimes. The emergence of transnational kidnapping syndicates, some linked to human trafficking networks and cyber financial crime rings, is a shared continental threat. Regional collaborations like SADC's Regional Early Warning System, REWs, and ECOWAS's Interpol Intelligence Exchange are key but still underutilized. Missionary work and vulnerability, the broader context of faith-based operations in high-risk zones. Josh Sullivan, self-described as a church-planting missionary, had moved with his family to South Africa in 2018 to minister to Xhosa-speaking communities. Missionary groups, often working in socioeconomically marginalized areas, are increasingly targeted by criminals due to their perceived foreign wealth, limited security, and public-facing roles. Faith-based organizations have played a critical role in Africa's education, health, and community development sectors. However, incidents like this may deter future humanitarian and missionary engagement, especially from the global north. The Evangelical Fellowship of South Africa and several international church associations are now calling for better protection measures for missionaries and religious institutions. Forward-looking approach. What needs to change? The Sullivan kidnapping must become a catalyst for systemic reform. Below are key forward-looking measures South Africa and the continent at large should consider. 1. Revamp community policing, rebuilding trust between communities and law enforcement through localized patrols, neighborhood watch programs, and youth engagement initiatives. 2. Regional intelligence sharing. African states must strengthen real-time information exchange through platforms like Interpol Africa and AU's African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism. 3. Public surveillance infrastructure. Urban and peri-urban areas must be equipped with surveillance cameras, automated license plate readers, and emergency communication points. 4. Diplomatic safety protocols. Embassies and consulates should collaborate with local law enforcement to develop tailored security briefings and safe corridors for their citizens. 5. Judicial efficiency and accountability. Speedy prosecution of kidnapping cases and harsher penalties could serve as a deterrent if consistently enforced. Voices from the community and international arena. The Sullivan family's spokesperson, Jeremy Hall, described the moment as terrifying, noting that they knew his name, which may suggest premeditation or even inside information. Meanwhile, Sullivan's mother, Tanya Morton Rinker, expressed heartbreak on Facebook and confirmed that both a U.S. congressman and embassy staff are involved in the recovery efforts. The Hawks remain tight-lipped, but confirmed they are following multiple leads. As of the time of this report, no ransom has been demanded, further deepening the mystery and widening the investigation's scope. Times Live, 2025. Geopolitical implications. The safety of missionaries and foreign nationals in Africa. The kidnapping of Pastor Josh Sullivan adds to a growing list of attacks targeting foreign missionaries, humanitarian workers, and expatriates in Africa, highlighting a pressing issue in global diplomacy, the duty of host governments to protect foreign nationals, especially those engaged in community development, religious service, or diplomatic assignments. While Western embassies, particularly from the United States and United Kingdom, maintain security protocols and warning systems for their citizens abroad, enforcement often depends heavily on the host country's capacity and willingness to act decisively. In fragile or transitional democracies, weak law enforcement and corruption can hinder international cooperation. In South Africa's case, the country still maintains relatively robust institutional frameworks compared to many others on the continent. However, the rise in violent and organized crime, police understaffing, and slow judicial processes are eroding its reputation as a relatively safe environment for international NGOs, missionaries, and investors. This trend may lead to a recalibration of foreign engagement strategies. Faith-based organizations and charities may opt for shorter-term missions, limit rural outreach, or increase spending on private security, diverting funds away from direct community services. The digital age of surveillance, a double-edged sword. In the aftermath of such kidnappings, The pressure is often on authorities to produce results swiftly. One of the modern tools at law enforcement's disposal is digital surveillance technology, CCTV footage, mobile phone tracking, license plate recognition, and forensic digital data analysis. South Africa's larger metros like Johannesburg and Cape Town are increasingly integrated with smart city infrastructure supported by partnerships with Chinese tech firms like Huawei. However, townships such as Motherwell and Gqeberha, where Sullivan was abducted, lack the digital surveillance grid necessary for rapid crime response. The irony here is that while many organized crime groups leverage encrypted communications and anonymous digital networks, such as the dark web or burner phones, law enforcement in high-risk areas often struggles with outdated systems, lack of digital training, and underfunded cybercrime units. Countries such as Kenya and Rwanda have demonstrated progress by incorporating digital forensics and facial recognition into their police operations, a direction that South Africa may need to urgently prioritize if it is to stem the tide of sophisticated criminal networks. How faith communities across Africa are responding. In the face of increasing threats, faith communities and church networks are developing proactive approaches to ensure the safety of clergy and congregants alike. Across Africa, from Nigeria to Kenya to South Africa, ecclesiastical security protocols are being introduced in collaboration with law enforcement and private security firms. Some of these measures include church security committees, armed or trained ushers who monitor entrances during services, emergency communication systems, WhatsApp groups and panic button apps linked to nearby police stations, discreet congregant profiling, encouraging vetting of visitors in sensitive areas without violating hospitality values, insurance and evacuation plans. Missionary organizations increasingly purchase kidnap and ransom (KNR) insurance, along with evacuation packages. The Southern Africa Church Security Consortium, SACSC, a newly formed coalition in 2024, has already started developing a national framework for faith-based institution security audits, hoping to replicate what is already in motion in West Africa. South Africa's political response and the Hawks challenge. The South African government, facing mounting international scrutiny over this case, has pledged a full investigation. President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration, already under pressure for its weak handling of crime and corruption, cannot afford the diplomatic fallout that would follow a prolonged, unresolved kidnapping of a U.S. citizen. The case's handover to the Hawks is a standard escalation for crimes with possible organized crime or transnational dimensions. The Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation has had notable success in busting illicit mining rings, drug syndicates, and high-level corruption, but their capacity is stretched. Lutarkol Avel Fumba, the Hawks spokesperson, emphasized in a press briefing that we are exploring all forensic, technological, and community intelligence avenues to secure Pastor Sullivan's safe return. While that statement offers reassurance, South Africans are growing skeptical. The gap between crime resolution rates and public safety perception remains wide. According to Afrobarometer 2024, only 27% of South Africans believe the police will solve serious crimes, down from 41% in 2016. Impact on the local community and church. The abduction has sent shockwaves through the Xhosa-speaking community that Pastor Sullivan had devoted his life to serving since 2018. Locals described him as a humble and generous man who did not deserve this. Congregants have gathered daily for prayer vigils, while others assist police with community tip-offs. This case also raises the question of psychological trauma among local congregants, including children who witnessed the armed intrusion. NGOs like the Trauma Center for Survivors of Violence and Torture in Cape Town are urging authorities to offer counseling services to affected families, noting that faith-based communities are often overlooked in trauma response planning. Meanwhile, the Fellowship Baptist Church has suspended all in-person activities, citing serious security concerns, and has shifted to virtual worship, a difficult but necessary measure. Implications for U.S. foreign policy in Africa. Rethinking engagement in high-risk zones. The abduction of Pastor Josh Sullivan is not merely a tragic incident. It could mark a turning point in how the United States approaches diplomatic and civil society engagement in high-risk African regions. While the U.S. has historically maintained a balanced posture of diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and soft power outreach across the continent, repeated threats to its citizens and missionaries may trigger a reassessment of engagement protocols, risk classifications, and funding allocations. Currently, South Africa remains a key partner in U.S.-Africa relations, with long-standing ties in trade via AGOA, military cooperation, notably through the Africa Command support programs, and civil society empowerment through USAID. However, under increasing domestic political pressure, the U.S. may be compelled to revise its security advisory status for regions like the Eastern Cape, especially if Sullivan is not recovered swiftly. The U.S. State Department's Bureau of Consular Affairs is reportedly reviewing the incident closely. A heightened advisory could impact short-term missionary travel approvals, insurance premiums for NGO field workers, church-sponsored scholarships, and outreach programs in South Africa. Furthermore, the Sullivan case could prompt congressional hearings on the safety of American citizens abroad, especially in countries with rising crime rates. A precedent exists. Following the 2021 kidnapping of American missionary Jeff Woodkey in Niger, U.S. Congress called for greater interagency coordination on hostage recovery and foreign travel safety. In this context, South Africa risks reputational damage not just among governments, but within the global faith-based and philanthropic community, whose footprint in Southern Africa has historically been significant. The business of risk. How insurance and security sectors are responding. The growing threat to missionaries and aid workers has birthed a booming niche market, kidnap and ransom, K&R insurance. Providers such as Lloyd's of London, Crisis 24, and Allianz Global now offer tailored packages for missionaries and foreign service workers operating in high-risk zones. In a typical policy, premiums are calculated based on location risk, based on crime and political instability indices, duration of stay, nature of activity, e.g., religious outreach versus business consulting, public visibility or online presence. These policies may cover ransom negotiations, crisis management, evacuation logistics, psychological support post-recovery. However, critics argue that the privatization of security through such instruments may exacerbate inequality, as only well-funded organizations or foreign nationals can afford them, leaving local pastors, community leaders, and church staff exposed to similar threats without safety nets. Private security firms in South Africa have also reported an uptick in inquiries from churches, NGOs, and expatriate families following Sullivan's abduction. Some are already exploring escort services for Sunday services and installation of surveillance systems at places of worship. Restoring faith in law enforcement, a continental challenge. The wave of kidnappings in South Africa fits into a broader African trend of declining public trust in law enforcement institutions. From Lagos to Lusaka, citizens increasingly report dissatisfaction with how police handle serious crimes. In a 2023 Afrobarometer report covering 34 African countries, only 28% of respondents believed that police usually operate professionally. Just 32% felt that police respond quickly when needed. In contrast, 48% said they were more likely to report crimes to local community leaders than the police. In South Africa, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, IPID, received over 6,000 complaints of police misconduct in 2023, including corruption, brutality, and dereliction of duty. While some reforms are underway, including efforts to professionalize the force and integrate modern technology, reform is slow and often politicized. Experts argue that without restoring confidence in police efficiency and neutrality, both foreign and local populations will continue to rely on private alternatives or community justice systems, sometimes leading to vigilantism and further destabilization. A 2025 briefing from the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, recommends the following: recruitment and vetting overhaul in SAPs and other African police forces, community police liaison boards with funding and enforcement power, regional centers of excellence in crime forensics, supported by the African Union. What faith-based organizations are saying: religious groups in South Africa and internationally are beginning to organize collective responses to the Sullivan abduction. The South African Council of Churches, SACC, released a statement condemning the act, calling it an assault on the sacred space of spiritual refuge and international brotherhood. The council also urged the government to provide enhanced police protection for churches, especially those led by foreign nationals, open communication channels between church leaders and local SAPS commanders, national funding for trauma counseling and community healing. In the U.S., the Southern Baptist Convention and Assemblies of God World Missions have issued travel advisories to their missionaries and requested updates from the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria. Some groups have announced temporary suspension of mission programs in Gqeberha, pending improvements in security assurances. A growing chorus of religious voices is also asking a deeper question: what does mission work look like in an era of growing insecurity? Some have begun calling for a shift toward local empowerment models, where African nationals lead spiritual outreach supported remotely by international allies, a move that could lessen exposure and foster local resilience. Resilience amid fear: how Township churches are strengthening security and solidarity. Despite the growing fear and uncertainty following Pastor Sullivan's abduction, Township churches across South Africa are not retreating. They are adapting and building resilience. In Motherwell, where the kidnapping occurred, and in similar communities across the Eastern Cape, a wave of grassroots mobilization is underway. Local pastors are banding together to form emergency alert networks, using platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram to share real-time updates, suspicious activity, and safety tips. Some churches have installed basic security cameras, reinforced entryways, and organized volunteer patrols during evening services. More notably, congregations are investing in trauma-informed ministry training, equipping church leaders to handle post-incident counseling and community healing. The Motherwell Interfaith Council, newly formed in response to the abduction, has begun hosting weekly prayer vigils and security workshops, demonstrating the power of faith-based solidarity in moments of crisis. This movement echoes similar initiatives in Nigeria, where churches in kidnapping-prone states like Kaduna and Benue have pioneered fortress faith protocols, including perimeter fencing, timed entry systems, and psychological first aid programs. While resource constraints remain a major obstacle, particularly in low-income townships, the community-led effort reveals a determined spirit to resist paralysis by fear. The psychological aftermath: kidnapping's hidden wounds. While much of the public attention centers on the search for Pastor Sullivan, equally critical is the psychological toll on his family, congregation, and fellow missionaries. Kidnappings are deeply traumatic events, especially when witnessed in sacred spaces such as churches, which are typically viewed as sanctuaries of peace and protection. Mental health professionals warn that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression are common among victims, witnesses, and even rescuers. Children present during the abduction may suffer from nightmares, withdrawal, and trust issues. Yet in many African communities, mental health remains stigmatized, underfunded, or misunderstood. In the wake of this incident, advocacy groups like SUDAG, South African Depression and Anxiety Group, and Trauma and Resilience Africa are pushing for a broader public conversation on emergency psychological care, especially for faith-based communities. They recommend the establishment of rapid response trauma teams trained to intervene after high-impact events, crisis hotlines and safe spaces within churches and community centers, mental health literacy programs tailored to cultural and religious sensitivities. This shift is especially important as more missionaries and religious leaders report burnout, trauma, and fear of return, affecting not only individuals, but also the continuity of spiritual and humanitarian missions. Social media, a tool for both crime and recovery. In the digital age, the same platforms that can be used to coordinate kidnappings can also be used to solve them. Authorities investigating Sullivan's abduction are reportedly analyzing social media activity, mobile data, and local CCTV footage to piece together what happened. Social media, however, is a double-edged sword. On one hand, criminals have used platforms like Facebook and Instagram to track targets' routines and locations, monitor wealth indicators or family ties, conduct surveillance via live-streamed events. On the other hand, law enforcement and community advocates are using social media to share suspect sketches and crowdsource information, track stolen vehicles or phones via public leads, build momentum and visibility for international pressure. In Sullivan's case, the family's spokesperson, Jeremy Hall, has been actively using Facebook to update followers and request prayers and information. His posts have gone viral, reaching thousands across South Africa and the US, ensuring the case remains in public view. However, misinformation is a growing concern. Unverified rumors about Sullivan's whereabouts or condition have been circulating, potentially compromising rescue efforts or traumatizing loved ones. Experts urge users to verify sources before sharing, and for platforms to prioritize verified alerts during high-stakes investigations. Lessons from other countries. A continental reflection. While South Africa faces a severe kidnapping challenge, other African nations have developed notable mitigation models worth examining. For instance, Rwanda has invested in AI-powered surveillance networks across urban areas, enabling faster crime response and reducing anonymity for criminal actors. Ghana established a centralized anti-kidnapping unit, well-resourced and trained to act swiftly in urban and rural settings alike. In Senegal, a partnership between the police and Islamic councils has enabled religious leaders to serve as first responders and mediators in abduction cases. These models suggest that coordinated efforts between security forces, religious institutions, and technology partners are key to making headway against organized kidnappings. Yet implementation varies by political will, public trust, and economic capacity. South Africa, with its advanced infrastructure but deeply strained police force, stands at a crossroads. The Sullivan case could either become another grim statistic or a turning point for national and continental transformation in public safety strategies. Poverty, crime, and the kidnapping economy, an uneasy nexus. At the heart of South Africa's kidnapping epidemic lies a complex systemic crisis, the intersection of poverty, unemployment, and organized crime. Townships like Motherwell, where Pastor Sullivan was abducted, are microcosms of broader socioeconomic decay. High youth unemployment, overstretched public services, and an absence of viable economic alternatives. In such conditions, criminal syndicates thrive, recruiting disillusioned young men with promises of quick wealth through extortion, hijackings, and ransom schemes. According to South Africa's 2024 quarterly labor force survey, the youth unemployment rate, ages 15 to 34, stood at a staggering 45.5%, with the Eastern Cape consistently ranking among the highest in joblessness and income inequality. When communities feel abandoned by the state, some individuals turn to survivalist criminal economies, and kidnapping has become one of the most profitable, low-risk options due to weak enforcement and low conviction rates. Organized crime experts at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, GTOC, describe kidnapping in South Africa as increasingly systematized and commercialized, often orchestrated by loosely connected networks who specialize in different phases of the operation: surveillance, execution, negotiation, and laundering. This model mirrors structures seen in Nigeria's northwest, where criminal gangs, locally known as bandits, exploit state fragility to run well-oiled abduction rackets. Though South Africa's situation is not driven by insurgency, the economic logic of criminality is strikingly similar. To break this cycle, experts argue that security solutions alone are insufficient. What's needed is a multi-pronged strategy that includes job creation initiatives tailored for township youth, vocational training programs aligned with regional economic needs, Early intervention programs in schools to disrupt gang recruitment, transparency, and accountability in township policing. Without addressing the root causes of desperation, the kidnapping economy will continue to grow, imperiling both locals and foreign nationals. Global media spotlight, pressure and diplomacy in real time. As the story of Pastor Sullivan's abduction continues to make headlines globally, from CNN and BBC to Christian Broadcasting Network and Al Jazeera, the influence of international media coverage is increasingly shaping the diplomatic response timeline. The intensity of global attention often dictates how quickly foreign governments escalate involvement and how aggressively local authorities pursue leads. In this case, the United States Congress, through its House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, is reportedly monitoring the situation and receiving daily briefings from U.S. Embassy staff in Pretoria. According to diplomatic analysts, media amplification serves two parallel functions. 1. Applying pressure on South African authorities to prioritize high-profile cases and increase transparency in investigation progress. 2. Mobilizing civil society and diaspora communities to coordinate advocacy, donations, and cross-border collaboration. Yet, there is also a risk. Intense media coverage may unintentionally raise the perceived value of the hostage, complicating rescue efforts or inflating ransom expectations, even in cases where no ransom was originally demanded. Balancing public awareness with operational security has become an art form for modern hostage negotiators, and in Sullivan's case, media platforms are being closely watched for both threats and clues. Diaspora mobilization, faith across borders for justice. Across the Atlantic, the African American and faith-based diaspora in the United States is mobilizing rapidly. Churches affiliated with Pastor Sullivan's mission are organizing online prayer vigils, some drawing over 50,000 participants on Facebook and YouTube, donation drives to support the Sullivan family and cover potential legal or rescue-related expenses, policy petitions urging U.S. lawmakers to press South African counterparts for swift action. Organizations such as the National Baptist Convention USA, Mission Board of Assemblies of God, and the Global Missions Fellowship have jointly issued a statement calling on the South African government to act with urgency, transparency, and resolve to bring Pastor Josh home. Meanwhile, South African diaspora groups in the US and UK are forming advocacy coalitions to not only demand justice in this specific case, but also highlight the broader crisis of insecurity in post-apartheid townships. The Sullivan case is quickly evolving into a symbolic rallying point, uniting diverse faith communities, human rights advocates, and transnational civil society organizations around a singular demand: accountability and safety for all, locals and foreigners alike. The Hawks, South Africa's elite unit under scrutiny. At the forefront of Pastor Sullivan's case is the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, DPCI, better known as the Hawks. Established in 2008 as a successor to the now-defunct Scorpions unit, the Hawks were envisioned as an elite, corruption-resistant task force to tackle organized crime, economic sabotage, and high-profile corruption. While the unit has notched several notable successes, including busting illicit gold smuggling rings and dismantling criminal syndicates linked to drug trafficking, its credibility and capacity have been repeatedly questioned, especially in complex kidnapping cases involving foreign nationals. One of the main challenges facing the Hawks is their resource constraint and overburdened mandate. With fewer than 3,000 personnel tasked with handling all priority crimes across the country, the unit often faces operational bottlenecks. Cases like Sullivan's, which require real-time digital forensics, international coordination, and extensive undercover intelligence, stretch its capabilities to the limit. In a 2024 performance audit by South Africa's Office of the Auditor General, the Hawks were found to have a 32% clearance rate for organized crime-related cases, a growing backlog of over 5,000 investigations, chronic delays in forensic and digital evidence processing. In response to mounting criticism, the Ministry of Police announced an upcoming retooling program for the Hawks, which includes investments in drone surveillance, cyber intelligence training, and international secondments. However, implementation remains slow, and interagency coordination with SAPS, Home Affairs, and private security remains inconsistent. The Sullivan case is now being viewed as a litmus test for the Hawks' operational readiness and their ability to respond to crises that draw both local and international attention. Diplomatic consequences: South Africa's global partnerships at risk. While South Africa enjoys significant global partnerships, from BRICS membership to strong bilateral ties with the EU, US, China, and AU member states, unresolved high-profile kidnappings risk eroding confidence in the country's governance and rule of law. Foreign missions routinely assess security benchmarks to determine aid disbursement, diplomatic staffing, missionary deployments, and travel advisories. If the Sullivan case remains unresolved or mishandled, South Africa could face upgraded travel warnings from Western countries, deterring tourists and mission workers, suspension of church-linked humanitarian projects, many of which serve vulnerable communities, increased premiums on international insurance underwriting for projects in South Africa. In 2023, when a German national was kidnapped and killed in KwaZulu-Natal during a humanitarian trip, Germany temporarily halted NGO fieldwork in the province and demanded a review of local security partnerships. The ripple effect was not only reputational, it had real economic and social consequences. The U.S. Embassy's role in Sullivan's case will likely shape future bilateral engagements, especially if congressional pressure intensifies. In worst-case scenarios, unresolved abductions may lead to diplomatic downgrades or conditional aid policies, particularly if South Africa is perceived as failing to protect foreign nationals. Precedents and policy reforms. What we've learned from past abductions. South Africa is no stranger to high-profile abductions, and in some instances, public outrage and diplomatic fallout have triggered systemic change. Case Study 1. The 2020 kidnapping of Shakira Abubakar, Durban. The abduction of the 8-year-old daughter of a wealthy Indian-South African businessman sparked national outrage. The case prompted the formation of Kidnapping and Abduction Priority Program, within SAPS, aimed at centralizing intelligence on such crimes. Though the program started with promise, it lost momentum due to funding cuts. Case Study 2, 2021. NGO worker abduction in Mpumalanga. A Canadian humanitarian worker was held for 11 days before being rescued. The case led to the pilot integration of facial recognition at rural checkpoints and improved coordination between SAPs and private security firms. However, the initiative was not expanded nationally due to legal and privacy concerns. Case Study 3, 2023. Gqeberha Chinese businessman kidnapping. Similar to the Sullivan case, the victim was abducted in the same city. Investigations revealed a cross-border syndicate linked to Mozambique and Zimbabwe, prompting South Africa to sign bilateral security protocols on kidnapping with neighboring states, a move that has yet to yield tangible results due to enforcement gaps. Each of these cases offered valuable insights, but lack of continuity in implementation has allowed organized crime to evolve faster than policy responses. Analysts believe that only a centralized, well-funded anti-kidnapping agency with national authority and diplomatic liaison capacity can turn the tide. The human side of the crisis: South African voices from the shadows of abduction. Behind every kidnapping statistic lies a human story, one of pain, fear, resilience, and, in some cases, haunting silence. While the abduction of Pastor Josh Sullivan has drawn global attention due to his American nationality and religious profile, thousands of South Africans endure similar ordeals in silence, often without media coverage, public outrage, or diplomatic intervention. In the same township of Motherwell where Sullivan was abducted, Nomsa M., a 38-year-old single mother, recounts how her 16-year-old son was taken by a gang in 2022 and held for 5 days before being released in exchange for her entire life savings. They told me, "We know you clean at the school. You're not rich, but you'll find a way." And I did. she says with tears. No arrests were made. Her story is echoed in nearby communities where kidnappings range from opportunistic taxi hijackings to targeted abductions of schoolchildren, business owners, and women for trafficking purposes. The trauma extends far beyond the victim. Families are left with debilitating financial burdens, communities live under constant fear, and faith in justice becomes deeply fractured. This erosion of public trust is reflected in 2024 findings from the Human Sciences Research Council, HSRC, which found that 71% of South Africans do not believe their local police station can protect them from violent crime, and more than half would hesitate to report a crime for fear of reprisal or futility. The faith factor: resilience, doubt, and collective healing. In times of crisis, churches in South Africa have historically served as pillars of hope, spiritual refuge, and social solidarity. However, the direct violation of a sacred space, a church turned into a crime scene, as in Sullivan's abduction, has challenged this dynamic. Faith leaders are now grappling with dual responsibilities, consoling traumatized congregants while confronting the harsh reality of insecurity within their own walls. For some, the incident has deepened spiritual resolve. For others, it has raised theological and existential questions about divine protection and suffering. We preach God's presence and protection, says Pastor Luthando T., a friend of Sullivan's from Port Elizabeth. But how do we comfort our people when a man of God is taken, armed men walk into our church, and the police arrive after the crime is done? This tension has triggered a renewed wave of interdenominational cooperation, with churches coming together not only in prayer, but also in strategic planning, sharing security resources, training ushers in emergency protocols, and creating support groups for congregants impacted by trauma. Some churches are embracing a faith and security doctrine, integrating biblical teachings with practical steps for risk management. Sermons increasingly include discussions on safety, mental health, and social justice, signaling a shift from pulpit-only spirituality to a more grounded activist ministry. Pathways forward. Expert recommendations for a safer South Africa. As the Sullivan case continues to unfold, it underscores an urgent question confronting South Africa and the broader continent. How can societies balance faith, freedom, and safety in an age of rising insecurity? Experts from criminal justice, civil society, and religious organizations are proposing a multi-sectoral roadmap that goes beyond reactive policing. 1. Establish a national anti-kidnapping task force, a permanent, multidisciplinary unit with dedicated forensic, psychological, cybercrime, and diplomatic liaisons. Clear mandate to collaborate with Interpol, embassies, and private investigators. 2. Strengthen community policing forums, CPFs. Empower local residents to co-design safety protocols and crime reporting systems, offer incentives and protection for whistleblowers and informants in high-risk areas. 3. Introduce Safe Worship Zones program, government-supported initiative providing physical infrastructure and emergency alert systems to protect places of worship. Involve faith leaders in designing crime prevention curricula for congregants. 4. Expand trauma support services. Integrate mental health services into public hospitals, schools, and churches. Train spiritual leaders and teachers in basic trauma response techniques. 5. Enforce cross-border intelligence protocols. Operationalize existing SADC regional security agreements focused on human trafficking and kidnapping. Establish joint task teams with Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Botswana to trace syndicate networks. These reforms will require political will, adequate funding, and civic participation, but they are essential if South Africa hopes to rebuild its reputation and reassure both citizens and the international community that it takes security seriously. The legal landscape. Gaps in South Africa's anti-kidnapping framework. While South Africa's legal system formally classifies kidnapping as a serious offense, enforcement gaps, outdated investigative protocols, and lenient sentencing have contributed to the persistence and growth of this crime. the Criminal Law, Sexual Offenses and Related Matters, Amendment Act, Criminal Procedure Act 51 of 1977, and provisions under common law address various forms of abduction. However, experts argue that the legal definition of kidnapping is too narrow, often excluding modern tactics used by syndicates, such as digital coercion, psychological manipulation, and staged disappearances. According to the 2024 Judicial Statistics Review, only 18% of reported kidnapping cases led to successful convictions, with most dismissed due to lack of forensic evidence, witness intimidation or disappearance, delays in court proceedings, lack of specialized prosecutors trained in transnational organized crime. In Sullivan's case, even though the Hawks are leading the investigation, prosecution will be contingent on airtight evidence, digital trail mapping, and international cooperation, components that require advanced coordination and resources not always available in high crime zones. Advocates within the South African Human Rights Commission, SAHRC, and Legal Resources Center, LRC, are now pushing for a comprehensive kidnapping and hostage protection bill, which would modernize definitions to reflect tech-enabled crimes, mandate immediate victim support services, create a national abduction registry to track patterns, syndicates, and high-risk zones, institute minimum sentencing guidelines for convicted kidnappers and accomplices, digital activism, amplifying justice, demanding accountability. As traditional institutions struggle to keep pace with the surge in abductions, digital activism has emerged as a critical force in shaping public discourse, demanding accountability, and supporting victims' families. The hashtag #BringBackJosh began trending on social media platforms within 24 hours of the news breaking, drawing tens of thousands of posts across Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Faith-based influencers, humanitarian organizations, diaspora leaders, and even South African celebrities have joined the digital campaign, urging authorities to act and appealing to global citizens to keep the pressure alive. These campaigns serve several functions: maintaining visibility so that cases don't fade from the public eye, crowdsourcing intelligence through tip-offs from local witnesses, creating solidarity networks to support affected families emotionally and financially, applying pressure on local and international authorities to prioritize cases and introduce reforms. However, digital activism also faces challenges. False information and conspiracy theories can circulate quickly, hampering investigations. Cyber attacks or bot interference have been reported on pages hosting sensitive case updates. Victims' families may be re-traumatized by online harassment or speculation. To address these risks, some groups are collaborating with cybersecurity firms and advocacy NGOs to create verified information hubs, which include official statements from the family and church, case timelines, donation verification links, legal counsel contacts. One such platform, the Justice Watch Africa Network, is currently supporting the Sullivan family by coordinating media relations, fundraising, and connecting them with legal support in South Africa and the United States. A regional ripple effect, Southern Africa on alert. The abduction of a U.S. pastor in South Africa has not only triggered a national reckoning, it has sent shockwaves across the Southern African region, prompting security reviews in neighboring countries. With porous borders and shared crime networks, countries such as Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Namibia, and Botswana are re-evaluating their own vulnerability to similar incidents. Security analysts at the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, warn that transnational syndicates exploit legal loopholes, weak customs monitoring, and political instability in border zones to transport victims, launder ransom payments, and evade prosecution. In a 2024 report titled Kidnapping Across Borders, the New Face of Organized Crime in Southern Africa, ISS concluded that over 30% of kidnappings in border provinces had transnational elements. Victim recovery time increases fourfold when borders are crossed. Only 3 of 16 SADC countries have updated their extradition and mutual legal assistance frameworks to address modern organized crime. In response, SADC has scheduled an extraordinary security summit for later this year, with kidnapping, human trafficking, and digital ransom economies listed as top agenda items. If Pastor Sullivan's case remains unresolved by then, it is likely to become a focal case study, representing both a humanitarian crisis and a diplomatic litmus test for the region's capacity to collaborate under pressure. Faith. Under fire. Shifting religious landscapes in a climate of insecurity. As South Africa confronts a new wave of violent crime, now encroaching even on sacred spaces, the country's religious landscape is undergoing a subtle but profound transformation. The abduction of Pastor Josh Sullivan in the middle of a worship service is not just a criminal act, it is a symbolic breach of sanctuary. Churches, mosques, and temples have long been seen as spiritual havens, but growing incidents of crime within their walls are forcing a theological, institutional, and operational reckoning. Across major cities and townships alike, congregations are rethinking their roles in a society where violence often outpaces justice. Some are pivoting toward activist theology, where sermons are not only spiritual exhortations, but also calls to community vigilance, civic action, and institutional reform. Historical echoes. Religion and resistance in the apartheid and post-apartheid eras. To understand the present role of religious institutions in combating fear and injustice, it is helpful to recall their historic role during the apartheid era, when churches like the Anglican Church under Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the South African Council of Churches became centers of resistance against oppression, inequality, and state violence. Back then, the pulpit was a podium of protest, and faith leaders were among the few who could speak truth to power. Even in the face of police raids, detentions, and censorship, they provided moral leadership, sanctuary for activists, and healing for communities traumatized by state brutality. In the post-apartheid era, that resistance function faded somewhat, replaced by the church's integration into civil society development, running schools, clinics, feeding programs, and spiritual outreach. But with the state now struggling to curb organized crime, many religious institutions are rediscovering their prophetic voice. Some are even asking, should we return to the posture of resistance, this time against corruption, lawlessness, and impunity? The emergence of spiritual-civic alliances. A growing number of churches are aligning with civil society movements to promote what some are calling a spiritual-civic doctrine, a blend of moral advocacy, public accountability, and local resilience. This doctrine sees crime not just as a legal failure, but also as a spiritual and societal fracture that demands holistic restoration. Examples of this emerging alliance include the Sanctuary and Safety Campaign in Gauteng, where churches partner with community policing forums to offer safe spaces and serve as local crime reporting hubs. Faith Against Fear, a multi-faith coalition in KwaZulu-Natal that organizes public forums, neighborhood watch trainings, and dialogues between police and communities. The Sacred Justice Initiative, a think tank of theologians, psychologists, and former prosecutors exploring restorative justice models rooted in African spirituality and Christian ethics. This shift is also being felt in seminaries and theological schools. Institutions like Stellenbosch University's Faculty of Theology and UNISA's School of Religion, Philosophy, and Classics are introducing courses on faith, trauma, and public violence, training a new generation of religious leaders to engage more directly with civic crises. Women of faith on the front line. In this transformation, women, especially women of faith, are emerging as vital agents of safety and healing. Female pastors, deacons, and lay leaders are leading trauma counseling initiatives, coordinating crisis response teams, and holding community circles for women who have lost children or family members to abductions and violence. In Gqeberha, the hometown of Pastor Sullivan's ministry, a group of Xhosa-speaking church mothers, known as Izimbokodo Zokolo, Faithful Stones, has mobilized daily prayer walks through the township. But their mission goes beyond intercession. They also gather intelligence, assist families in reporting crimes, and provide meals to victims awaiting justice. As one of them, Ma'am Grace Lujabe, said during a recent prayer vigil, "If the police will not protect us, and the criminals have no fear of our God, then we must rise, not just to pray, but to prepare, to teach, and to defend what is sacred." Challenges and internal divides. Despite these encouraging developments, not all religious communities agree on how to respond. Some pastors fear that too much political or security engagement could dilute their spiritual mission. Others worry about retaliation if churches are seen as cooperating with law enforcement. There are also internal theological debates about whether suffering should be accepted as divine testing or resisted as unjust social evil. In some Pentecostal and charismatic circles, the emphasis remains heavily on prayer and divine intervention, while in mainline Protestant and Catholic circles, a more activist approach is emerging. This divergence reflects broader tensions in African theology between prosperity doctrine, liberation theology, and indigenous spiritual resilience. Navigating these differences, while building a unified front against violence, will be a crucial test for the future of faith communities in South Africa and beyond. Youth mobilization and prevention, building safety from the ground up. As faith communities awaken to the growing threat of violence in their midst, a parallel movement is rising among South African youth, who are increasingly taking leadership roles in prevention, awareness, and peer intervention programs. These efforts mark a critical shift from a reactionary model to a proactive, community-centered safety culture. In Gqeberha and across the Eastern Cape, youth fellowships and student Christian organizations, SCOs, are organizing events that blend spirituality, civic education, and personal security. Workshops such as Faith and Safety in the Streets now accompany regular youth services, while local school clubs are inviting pastors, social workers, and former gang members to speak about the dangers of organized crime and the power of early resistance. One standout initiative is the Safe Schools Network, a collaborative pilot project involving churches, township schools, and community policing forums. The project trains students to identify early signs of recruitment into criminal networks, use anonymous reporting tools like SMS-based hotlines, engage peers in dialogues around values, courage, and social justice. The project also equips educators with trauma-informed teaching techniques, recognizing that many students have already been exposed to violence directly or indirectly. Pastoral care is being integrated into school life, with clergy visiting classrooms and offering counseling during breaks. Young people must be taught to guard their lives, their friends, and their faith, says Thabiso Maketha, a 22-year-old theology student and community organizer in the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality. "We're not just future leaders, we are frontline defenders now." Interfaith councils, bridging divides for collective protection. The problem of violent crime in South Africa transcends any single religion. As such, interfaith councils are becoming vital platforms for cooperation, information sharing, and coordinated responses to community threats. The Eastern Cape Interfaith Peace Council, formed after a spate of religiously neutral kidnappings in 2023, brings together Christian pastors, Muslim imams, Jewish leaders, traditional healers, and civic elders in monthly forums. These gatherings explore not only theological solidarity, but also practical tools for coordinated crisis messaging across religious communities, shared safe space agreements, e.g., using mosques as temporary shelters or churches as trauma clinics, joint advocacy for improved security infrastructure in township zones. The interfaith model is also being promoted by the South African Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious, and Linguistic Communities, CRL Commission, which argues that multi-faith alliances are essential to rebuilding social cohesion in a fractured society. "Criminals don't ask about your religion," notes Imam Yusuf Hassan, a council member. "They only see opportunity, so we must be united, not just in faith, but in action." Media's ethical crossroads between exposure and exploitation. As the Sullivan kidnapping gains global traction, the role of mainstream and social media has come under renewed scrutiny. While platforms like the BBC, Al Jazeera, and News 24 have amplified awareness and kept the story alive, critics warn that reckless reporting or sensational headlines can do more harm than good. Ethical media coverage of kidnappings must balance public interest and awareness with operational confidentiality, support for victims' families with respect for their privacy, pressure on authorities with avoidance of inflating ransom demand narratives. In past cases, irresponsible speculation has led to false sightings that misled investigators, online harassment of families perceived as not doing enough, undue fear among tourists and expatriates, affecting local economies. To address these challenges, journalists and media houses are being urged to adopt updated ethical guidelines, particularly for crime reporting. Organizations like the South African National Editors Forum, SANF, and Media Monitoring Africa, MMA, are already working on new protocols for covering ongoing abduction cases, violent incidents in places of worship, interfaith or international humanitarian work. These guidelines include checklists for verifying sources, consulting legal experts, and partnering with trauma specialists to shape coverage that is accurate, constructive, and human-centered. The role of the international community: solidarity, not saviors. As diplomatic pressure intensifies around the Sullivan case, international partners must navigate their involvement with sensitivity and respect for South Africa's sovereignty, while recognizing the urgency of cross-border cooperation. The United States, in particular, has a delicate role. It must advocate firmly for the safety of its citizen, while also avoiding a neo-colonial posture that undermines local efforts. The best outcomes, analysts argue, will come from quiet diplomacy, behind-the-scenes intelligence sharing, and mutual legal assistance, support for capacity building in forensic and investigative capabilities, long-term partnerships with civil society rather than top-down interventions. Beyond bilateral relations, global institutions like the African Union, AU, and UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, can play a constructive role in funding anti-kidnapping programs across southern Africa, training judges and prosecutors in handling complex cross-border crime, strengthening digital crime-fighting infrastructure in high-risk regions. The Sullivan case, tragic as it is, presents an opportunity for the international community to move from reactive concern to proactive partnership, supporting African solutions to African security challenges, anchored in community, culture, and collaboration. The Sullivan family, navigating crisis with faith and determination. As the investigation unfolds on the ground in South Africa, Pastor Josh Sullivan's family has become the emotional and spiritual anchor of a global community gripped by uncertainty and united in prayer. From their temporary safe location, his wife and children have maintained a composed but firm public stance, calling for justice, not only for their own family, but for all victims of similar crimes across South Africa and the continent. His mother, Tanya Morton Rinker, continues to rally support from the U.S., updating followers through verified social media accounts, while also pressing U.S. congressional representatives to prioritize the case through diplomatic channels. The family's spokesperson, Jeremy Hall, has highlighted their deep love for South Africa, emphasizing that their mission was never political, but purely humanitarian and spiritual. "We came to serve, not to be served. We still believe in the beauty of the people here. But this system must protect the people it serves, including the ones who came to stand alongside them." Their response has struck a chord across multiple layers of society. Local South Africans see in them the image of thousands of families who suffer in silence. Foreign missions view them as a test case of international protection protocols, and religious communities see in them a symbol of enduring faith amid fear, symbolism, and systemic change. What this case represents: the abduction of Pastor Josh Sullivan is not just a singular tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting broader dysfunctions in law enforcement, justice delivery, and public protection in post-apartheid South Africa. It also represents the fragile space where faith, development, and danger intersect. This case embodies the painful irony of violence targeting those working to heal the wounds of violence. It challenges African governments to ask themselves hard questions. If a pastor preaching peace can be abducted from the pulpit without consequence, who then is safe in our societies? The Sullivan story has become a touchstone for rethinking security not just as a policing issue, but as a civic, spiritual, and institutional necessity. From churches to classrooms, township streets to diplomatic corridors, it demands coordinated, courageous, and compassionate leadership. Advice to African leaders: from crisis to transformation. As this crisis continues to unfold, African leaders, national and local, must seize this moment not with fear or denial, but with moral clarity and strategic vision. The time for performative condolences is over. Action is now required on multiple fronts. 1. Invest in people-centered security reform police services with community-based models that prioritize prevention, visibility, and public trust. Provide resources, training, and integrity checks to ensure responsiveness to all citizens, rich or poor, local or foreign. 2. Strengthen legal and judicial frameworks. Modernize kidnapping laws, expedite case processing, and empower prosecutors with tools to pursue organized crime effectively. Justice must be both swift and consistent. 3. Empower faith and civil society actors. Recognize religious institutions not only as spiritual centers, but as co-guardians of social welfare and peace. Engage them in formal community safety frameworks and leverage their moral influence to foster reconciliation and healing. 4. Collaborate regionally on security intelligence. Transnational crime cannot be solved by one country alone. Governments must fully operationalize SADC, AU, and Interpol frameworks to track syndicates, share intelligence, and enforce accountability across borders. 5. Champion mental health and victim support. Trauma is not just an individual problem, it is a societal one. Invest in counseling, psychosocial services, and trauma-informed care, particularly in violence-afflicted communities. Summary: key messages from the Sullivan abduction case. Kidnapping is a national emergency in South Africa and increasingly a regional crisis across Africa. Faith-based institutions are vulnerable frontline workers, requiring protection and partnership in community safety. The Sullivan case symbolizes systemic failures, but also inspires grassroots resilience and international solidarity. Public trust in justice and policing is waning, but it can be rebuilt through courageous reform, interfaith alliances, and civic engagement. The future of African security depends not only on government policy, but on a unified front of leaders, faith communities, youth, and international allies. Pastor Josh Sullivan's story is still unfolding. Whether it ends in heartbreak or in healing will depend not only on the hands of his captors or rescuers, but on the resolve of a continent to say, with one voice, never again. The Bold African Voice, BAV, will continue to follow this developing story with compassion, clarity, and commitment to justice. Let this not be just a headline, but a turning point. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV. Will this be another forgotten case, or a turning point for Africa? If this story moved you, it's time to act. Share this video, demand accountability, and join us in reshaping Africa's future, one voice at a time. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and click the notification bell for more fearless African reporting. This is The Bold African Voice, where truth echoes louder.